So, Gloria Steinem, in 2016, you're an Emmy nominee for the second time in your life, and this time it's for being an executive producer of this really wonderful documentary series, Woman, with Gloria Steinem. And it's on Viceland, which I think gave a lot of us pause when we first got the press release touting not so much the series, but where it was. How did that end up on Viceland?
It happened because I was at a meeting of ideas held by Google, and I was talking about violence against women worldwide that is now cumulatively enough so that there are fewer females on Earth than males. Shane Smith was in the audience, was very moved by that, and said to Amy Richards, my colleague, and me, we need to do something about this. It's really all thanks to his response. So when we came back to New York, we began to plan this series. I realized that it's unexpected because lots of people have said that to me and no doubt to him. So we made buttons for all of the people who were putting the show together at the wrap party that say, I put the V in Vice. Do you think that helps?
Absolutely. And with all the work you've done over the years and decades, and including like the Women's Media Center and your initiative Women Under Siege, how does this fit in with all of that? Is this because it's television? Did you get a wider audience because you've got pictures to go with the words? You feel?
Yes, I'm sure there is a much wider audience because of Vice and the broad distribution. But what is most different to me is that it's the most like being there yourself, because these 8 women correspondents are on the ground asking questions in a good journalistic way, that is, not presuming the answer, but responding in a human way, not being detached. So these are not constructed documentaries, which have another kind of purpose because they can show history and, analysis in a different way. These are like walking around and being there yourself, and I think that's their big value.
Well, and I think that to that point, the show is in a category that's documentary / nonfiction series, and to my mind, it's a nonfiction series because it's that point of view, and I think that's what really makes it unique. Is these correspondents are journalists that, as you said, they're having a human response. It isn't the binary, the pro and the con, such as it is, the traditional journalism where you have to present both sides, as though there are both sides to the issues that they're exposing.
Well, no, but I'm glad you said that, because I think one of the problems of traditional media in general is the idea that there are two sides to an issue when there may be 6 or 10. The whole world is divided into 2 kinds of people: those who divide everything into 2 and those who don't.
Right, and it's not men, women. That's what people would presume when you say 2.
No, I think it's great that you notice that, because I think the whole idea of division into 2 is a result of dividing everything into masculine and feminine, which of course is wrong for the first place, because there's a whole full circle called human. So I think that this shows the subtleties and the realities in a way that pro and con journalism does not, and in fact that's more about conflict.
Right, and then especially when going into countries like Pakistan, the Congo, Zambia, where it's what was so fascinating, because it's sort of with exploring the lives of these women that within the context of their culture, their religion, and trying to understand from our Western point of view what's their place. Are they, because we I think as Westerners want to, these poor victims, and this we impose this kind of victim mentality. And I don't. No,
I don't think. I think they're enormously strong, these women.
Yes.
And I don't think. I mean, we are witnesses to what's happening to them. And I think when something bad is happening to you, you do want to know that it's not in secret. You want to know that someone will see and understand. And hence the line underneath, woman, be a witness, which was very important. And also the chance to be an activist by looking at the end of the show, where you can see groups that are helping. But I do think that we probably need to rethink our use of the word culture, because there's a real way in which, in this country too, what happens to men is called politics, and what happens to women is called culture. But that's also politics. It's also about power.
Right. Well, and that's when I was saying about the victim mentality is that we impose upon them. It's sort of because when it looks at questions of religion and the way religion is being used to subjugate them, that I feel like sometimes in the West that we kind of bring a judgment to that in terms of how we see the woman.
Well, it's true, but I mean, in this country, because of anti-abortion Christian fundamentalists, we have murdered 11 people in abortion clinics. Mm-hmm. So, this is unacceptable wherever it is.
And I think what also the documentary series does so well, the nonfiction series, I'm calling Victim to That, calling it a documentary, is coming home, looking at different institutions in the United States, the Army, the prison system, and then also, which is, again, I think we sort of read the stories, but it's seeing. It is the power of the visual, I think.
Yes, and we wanted to make clear that this was not otherizing, other cultures and other continents, that in fact, what's happening to mothers in prison here, what's happening to Native Canadian women next door is also part of this story.
And what's really, since it's been made, the government in Canada is about to announce a very expansive inquiry into missing and murdered Aboriginal women. We just had days ago a ceasefire in Colombia. I mean, it makes me want to wonder if there's going to be a next series. Will you revisit some of these stories, or is it there's so many that you've got to move on and look at others?
Well, we're just trying to really think about that and see what is the most useful, whether to continue to follow these stories. I mean, for instance, it's always true, or usually true, that after conflict in which women have been enlisted as a kind of surplus labor force for the revolution, so to speak, then it's back into a traditional role. It happened here after World War II. It happened in Algeria in a big way, so there were massive female suicides because they were part of the liberation movement from France, and then they were stuffed back into their secondary positions. There are echoes and parallels beyond the country in which these documentaries are done. So we're really, we are going to continue, and we're just trying to figure out what is the most helpful and useful and positive.
Yeah, and I think it is what you were saying. I had this in mind when I was sort of doing my research and into you and the series, and thinking of when you were growing up, you would see on the film, you saw powerful women, and yet by the time you're sort of coming of age in the 50s, then it becomes Donna Reed. It is the housewife doing, the work. No. And it's fascinating. And I was really, what I was struck by that you go to Smith College, and a women's college doesn't have a woman president until the centennial, until 1975.
Yes, absolutely.
What was that sort of, when you were there, I'm fascinated by it. Did it seem odd that there was a man running this women's college? Was it? Well, or was it
I'm not sure. I'm not sure I was smart enough at that point, because the whole of the 1950s was very traditional, and what the president was saying at that point, the male president, was that if we are ever going to have educated children, we have to have educated mothers. Now, it's also true that there were rebels on campus. Sylvia Plath, for instance, the poet, was 2 years ahead of me. But I have to say that having lived through the 50s, I can kind of understand why she committed suicide. I mean, because she was a person of such enormous talent and yet always in a secondary spot. And I mean, it's deeper than that, of course, with her family and so on. But it was profoundly different, which I have to say, having experienced all that makes me something of an optimist because I have seen a lot of change.
Yeah, absolutely. And the fact that that all these women are having a voice through this series and presenting themselves. It's interesting you were saying about talented women, and I thought I knew a lot about you until I discovered that this isn't your first time at the Emmys. You were an Emmy nominee in 1965.
But I have to say, I know, but that was so long ago that I myself forgot. So thank you for looking it up. Right.
Well, what's fascinating when you mention that is you can tell your friend Jane Fonda that you've beaten her by 2 years because I spoke to Jane I spoke to Jane a couple of years ago when she was on Broadway and nominated for a Tony for 33 Variations. And we spoke about, I mentioned her first Tony nomination, which she insisted did not happen.
And what was it for? What was the first one for?
It was a play that only lasted about 2 weeks called There Was a Little Girl. And this is the part that you both will appreciate. Back then, in the early days of the Tony Awards, they didn't give out trophies. The men got cigarette cases and the women got compacts.
That's great. Oh, that's so perfect. You know what? That's once. Remember when Nixon made his enemies list? Remember that?
Oh,
okay,
sure.
I was quite honored to be on his enemies list, and then another member of the enemies list gave us each an award, which was a tie clip.
Well, it's interesting. So that was late 60s, 70s. Now, one of the other nominees in this category that you're in is a CNN documentary series called The 70s. Now, I know you took part in the 60s one of that. Were you part of the 70s? Are you in that? Were you interviewed because you were such a force?
Yes. Yeah. No, I was. Yes, I was interviewed. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. And now we've sort of gone. I'm sure you do. I know you just recently looked back on your life with My Life on the Road, a wonderful book, and I was struck by one of the chapter titles, Surrealism in Everyday Life, because that's the name of the segment that you did on that show that you were nominated for.
Yeah, and that was the category that I was writing. I was the girl writer at that point on That Was the Week It Was. And I had the great pleasure of looking through the world's newspapers every week and picking out the kind of news item that you think, you can't make this stuff up, it was so bizarre, and giving them an award. So I made up the title, Surrealism in Everyday Life, and I've continued to use it ever since, as you can see.
And that's what, I know that you it was a satirical program. David Frost had done it in England. He brought it to America. It was controversial. You were the girl writer, but did you do it on your own? Were you part of a writer's room? Do you remember?
Well, it was a very communal show, so I had a department, but we were often part of kind of editorial meetings. Herb Sargent was the head writer, and he was a very creative, laid-back, wonderful person. I have to say that because it was the first satirical show on mainstream television, that NBC just hated it because they were always sending their continuity acceptance department people, which means censors, because it was live, so they would send them down at the very last minute and tell us that we could not use X or Y or Z. So it was great to see Saturday Night Live advance the field much more.
Well, I think if you talk to them, I think they had that. You were the Tina Fey of your time in a way. But I have to.
Well, no, I don't think, because I was never performing. I was always backstage writing. Right.
Well, now that's another thing. Again, that I was fascinated to read that you starting as a journalist, as a writer, not wanting to be on camera. That how did you found your voice, and you just felt that you had to speak out and how did that come about, that you became such a public persona?
Well, it came about only after I was in my mid-30s, I think. I had certainly devoted a lot of my life to not speaking in public. But because I wasn't able to publish with the editors I'd been freelancing for what I wanted to say about the tremendous excitement and energy and new ideas of the burgeoning, very diverse women's movement, I couldn't get it published. And at the same time, because I had been a writer and was then also writing a political column for New York Magazine, I was getting invitations to speak. So it seemed like the only way to get the word out was to do that, but I couldn't do it by myself. I was too afraid to speak by myself. So I asked a couple of fearless friends, one at a time, to become a speaking team with me. And I'm very grateful for that, because I never otherwise would have discovered that as wonderful as writing on the page is, as wonderful as the screen is, something happens when you are in a room physically with each other.
Right.
A kind of empathy and understanding that is unique.
Yeah, and what I love is now you've done that now, with this series, you're giving voice to these correspondents and to the women that they've profiled, that they're finding their voices, and but in a collective way. I think that's what's really wonderful about it.
Yeah, so these correspondents were picked by Vice. They are extraordinary. I mean, the one thing that I think has not yet quite happened is that each one of these women should be profiled. These correspondents are really, and I notice in talking to both women and men who have seen this series, they're inspired by the correspondents. They want to be those correspondents. So I hope they get more attention.
Oh, absolutely. And what I love is that you might have been the woman on that ballot 51 years ago with your first Emmy nomination. Now what I like is the fact that Shane Smith, the vice chair, is the only man with your nomination. It's all women, and then you. So I
hadn't thought of that. I hadn't thought of that. Well, he really deserves the credit, because it was his human understanding response, to the fact that there were now fewer females on Earth than males, and he, as I have said before, he told me that it was because he had daughters. And I said to him, listen, I've said this to other people with daughters and didn't get this response. I think he has to face the fact that he has a good heart.
Yeah. Well, it's an achievement on both your parts, and as you said, especially with these correspondents that went out and brought all of us these stories. And I must say, each and every one of them sends you right to the computer to Google to find out more. I mean, it's just. Oh,
I'm so glad.
So
I'm so glad.
Yeah. Well, listen, thank you for taking the time. And
thank you. Thank you.
And best of luck. Okay.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. You've managed to bring my 30-year-ago life and current life together. It's a first. Thank you.